Resident Evil 4. This is one of those games that I kind of worried about whether or not I wanted to cover. And only because there's just so many mixed feelings when it comes to Resident Evil 4 within the community, within myself, because a lot of people have played this game. It's spanned from the PS2 to now. Like, there's been remastered over and over again, been ported to every single console imaginable after the PS2 and GameCube era. You know, like they're doing a remake. I mean, depending on when you watch this, I mean, the remake could be out. But it's one of those games that at the end of the day has touched a lot of people within the Resident Evil community and outside of the Resident Evil community. Like, just third person games in general have been affected by this game. So that's why this game is a little bit rough to touch on. But what we're going to do here in my retrospective, we're going to take a look at this game. We're going to talk about this game, how it made me feel when it released, and how my thoughts about this game have evolved over time. So thank you so much for watching this video, and let's get started with my Resident Evil retrospective.
Resident Evil Retrospective.
So a lot of these retrospectives that I've been doing, especially when it comes to the Resident Evil games, is more so a subjective kind of look at the games. It's not really like an objective breakdown, although I do try to stay as objective as possible with certain things. But really, this is kind of a look back at the game and how it made me feel at release. And like I mentioned, how I feel now. A lot of that is just put together in just feelings, and that, like, feelings is a subjective kind of emotion. That is a subjective thing that you look at. It's not really a objective manner of looking at a specific game. Resident Evil 4, as I mentioned, is one of those games that just spanned so much and has influenced so much. And usually I don't talk about the history of some of these games just because so many people have talked about the history of these games. But RE4 is one of those games that is kind of hard to not talk about the history of it, because the history is just as important as how the game made me feel. Because the history of RE4 has affected gaming as a whole, and so kind of need to at least touch on the history a little bit before we go into the actual retrospective part of the video with my thoughts and views on how the game is now. So a little bit on the history of it. Resident Evil 4 has a bit of a rough development history. It went through, I think it was like 4 or 5 different variations, different builds, with the 5th one either being the one before the final release or the final release itself. It's kind of murky when it comes to that. What we know is that one build became Devil May Cry, because initially that build showed Leon exploring a castle and he was doing some weird combos and all this stuff. Basically, the combat that you saw in Devil May Cry, that was Leon initially, not Dante. And it was weird. It was not befitting of what Resident Evil was. It was some weird kind of amalgamation of like this just weird kind of God of War style gameplay. And it just didn't make sense to have Leon, who was a normal human, doing stuff like this. So that version of the game was not scrapped, but it was converted into what became Devil May Cry, and the rest is history for Devil May Cry. So Devil May Cry is absolutely attested to Resident Evil 4. And it's funny because Devil May Cry 5 was made because of Resident Evil 7. And only because of the RE engine, not specifically because of a certain build or anything like that, but the RE engine itself, Devil May Cry, was built on the RE engine, which was created for Resident Evil 7. So it's kind of funny how that kind of went full circle on that, but we're we're not here to talk about Devil May Cry or Resident Evil 7. We're here to talk about Resident Evil 4. Another build of the game became Haunting Ground, which is probably one of the rarest games for the PS2. And I have not played Haunting Ground. Maybe I'll remedy that one day. I haven't played it. I don't own it. It's an expensive game, and I don't have the money to just throw away at a physical copy of that game, as much as I wish I did. That was the castle build that had turned into Haunting Ground, but portions of the castle build was also kept in the final release, as you probably saw if you played the game. Another build of the game was a fog version, where basically this fog, if Leon had walked into the fog, he could potentially die. This fog would kind of envelop the area, similar to kind of how like Silent Hill has that fog, but they canceled that version of the game because of the limitations of the GameCube, which I should mention that the game was being developed by the game or for the GameCube in mind. But anyways, so due to the limitations of the GameCube, they canceled that version of the game. There was also a Hookman version of the game where Leon was going to be chased around by a man with a hook. That version of the game was scrapped as well. And then there was also the hallucination version, which showed Leon being infected and hallucinating. There's video. You can find the videos on YouTube of the hallucination version as well as the Hookman version. And in the hallucination version, you see Leon like fighting dolls or something, which is funny because if you look at RE Village, which we'll get to this in more detail when we get to Resident Evil Village, but in RE Village pays homage to RE4 in a lot of ways, specifically the canceled versions of the game, such as the castle version, because you have the Dimitrescu castle. You have the Hookman version, which is seen in the Dimitrescu daughters. You have the hallucination version, which is seen in the Benevento house. So it's funny that they were able to, or not able to, but they kept in mind some of those builds when they did Resident Evil Village. So just kind of like a little throwback on that one. So with those things in mind, the final version that we got for Resident Evil 4, I was going to say Resident Evil 7. The final version that we got for Resident Evil 4 still had some things like the plot point of Leon getting infected. It still had the castle aspect of things. There were still some things that they kept, but the final version that we got was not what they were building at first, because some of those initial builds were also a third-person perspective with tank controls and fixed camera angles, much like the originals. So the build that we got for Resident Evil 4 actually stemmed off because sales for the Resident Evil games started going down. Resident Evil 0, Remake, and Code Veronica didn't particularly sell well, so they needed to do something to revamp and revitalize this series. Hence the version of Resident Evil 4 that we got that favored more action as opposed to horror, which we're going to touch on in a little bit here. So when this game released, I didn't initially buy it on the GameCube. Like, it released on the GameCube, and the marketing for this thing was kind of different. It really was. You had like Shinji Mikami wearing glasses and like talking about the game and like hyping it up so it's all scary and stuff. When the game released, it wasn't like a scary game, but the game did have a lot of gore and stuff in it. Still does, depending on the version that you're playing. And I say that because the American version versus the Japanese version has more gore than the Japanese version does. Things like Leon getting his head cut off by the chainsaw and things like that were censored in the Japanese version. And people want to say that the Americans censor more stuff in Japanese. Well, Japanese stuff tends to censor things themselves, but that's whatever. Sorry, little side note on that one. So I didn't play it when it released on the GameCube initially. I didn't buy it, which is weird. I don't know why I didn't buy it. I had a GameCube. I could have bought it. And I was a Resident Evil fan, but for some reason I just didn't buy it. I don't know why. I bought Remake, I bought Zero, I bought Code Veronica when it was on the PS2, not on the Dreamcast. I didn't own a Dreamcast. But if I bought all those, why didn't I buy Resident Evil 4? I just didn't. To this day, I don't know why I didn't buy it, but I didn't. I own it now on GameCube. I have the collector's edition for it on GameCube, not with the controller though. That controller is expensive, but it's really cool though. That chainsaw controller is magnificent. Anyways, I have the collector's edition on GameCube from the GameStop collector's edition, as well as a collector's edition on PS2. But when this game released, there was so much hype behind it. It gave us something different. It was an over-the-shoulder third-person perspective, which to this day I don't understand why we never got a game like this before Resident Evil 4. Like you think about it, you look back at this, and you're like, why haven't we had before Resident Evil 4? Why didn't we have a third-person shooter that was over the shoulder? Like this was just screaming for Rainbow Six or whatever, like to be made in this kind of style of gameplay. But we didn't. Resident Evil 4 was the first one to actually do this kind of style of gameplay. And it was magnificent. You control Leon, it's kind of over the shoulder, and when you aim, it kind of zooms in a little bit. And you have that laser sight point, and you just go and shoot and aim. And it worked. It worked really well. Especially with the GameCube and the PS2 in mind. Like, it worked very well. But the gameplay was a little simplistic at times. But we'll get to that. So, when I did play this on PS2, because that was my first time playing it on PS2, it was actually a copy that was given to me by my brother-in-law. He wasn't my brother-in-law yet, but my wife and I, we were dating, and her brother gave me a copy of Resident Evil 4 to play on my PS2. And so I played it, and I played it and loved it. I played it like crazy, like non-stop. I beat this game over and over and over again. And then you had Separate Ways with Ada, and I played that over and over again. Assignment Ada. This game had a lot going for it. And I loved every single minute that I spent playing this game. I really did. And, back then, because of how new the game was, right? Like, you kind of have that new game blinder on, kind of like a new relationship. So you have those blinders on. You're not really looking at the flaws. And so it wasn't until much later that the flaws started to kind of peek through. And this happens a lot. This happens in relationships. It happens in friendships. It happens in video games, in movies, in TV shows, everything, right? So the more that you watch things, or the more that you play things, or experience things, the more the flaws start to stand out, because you're so used to that experience already that you're not really paying attention so much to that experience that grasped you at first, but instead you're starting to pick up on the things that bother you. And so, of course, throughout the years, that's what's happened with Resident Evil 4, not just with me, but with people in the community as well. Like, honestly, I've encountered a lot of people in the Resident Evil community who kind of feel the same way when it comes to Resident Evil 4. So, Resident Evil 4, when it was made with a couple things in mind. Capcom needed to grab a new audience. They needed to get people interested in the Resident Evil franchise. Well, there were a couple ways to do that. Do you continue off of the previous games, which clearly wasn't selling well? Or do you just revamp things and keep it in the same continuity, but tell a new story? And that's what Resident Evil 4 did. That's what they chose to do. They did a time skip, and they chose to tell a new story with Leon from Resident Evil 2, but at the end of the day, the game had no real connection to any of the previous games. And before you say, oh, but Wesker's in there with Separate Ways, before you say that, the GameCube version, the original version of Resident Evil 4, did not have Separate Ways. There was a mention of Wesker, but there was no Wesker in the game. There was no tie-ins with Umbrella. Nothing. It was its own thing. And it worked. It worked that way. It grabbed a new audience the way that they intended. And even to this day, when I'm interacting with Resident Evil people or people in the Resident Evil community, and I hear them say that, oh, their favorite games are Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 5. First thing I ask them is, was Resident Evil 4 your first game? Was that your first Resident Evil game? Typically, I want to say like maybe 7 out of 10 times, the answer will be yes. And the reason why is because, again, they were that new audience that Capcom was looking for. So, of course, with Resident Evil 4 being their first entry into the franchise, they're going to lean more towards that kind of gameplay. So, Resident Evil 4 is going to be their favorite, along with Resident Evil 5. And usually those fans are also kind of impartial to Resident Evil 6. They're not so critical of Resident Evil 6 as older fans are, who were fans from the original games. You know, the old style PS1 games and Code Veronica. So it's kind of a weird division that happens when you talk about Resident Evil 4, which is why I was kind of hesitant to talk about this and to express how I feel when it comes to Resident Evil 4. Because this division also happens again with Resident Evil 7. It's so funny when you talk about games like this that are completely changing the way that the gameplay is. And so Resident Evil 4 did that. But not only did it change the gameplay, it changed the storytelling. It changed a lot of things. You got rid of the survival mechanics that was in the Resident Evil games. And again, they favored action. And to keep up with that action, now enemies dropped items. But we'll get to that because that's going to be more into my my critical analysis of Resident Evil 4. So right now we're just talking about feelings. So Resident Evil 4, when I'm playing it for the first time, you know, like I see Leon and I'm thinking, I'm like, this is not the same Leon that I encountered in Resident Evil 2. This is a different Leon. Like, it's still Leon, right? Like it's almost like an alternate reality Leon is what it felt like. You know, you took the same character, but now he's just got like a kind of different attitude. Instead of that optimistic Leon that you had in Resident Evil 2, you have kind of a more sarcastic kind of like, you know, I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for besides sarcastic, but you just have this weird kind of jaded, that's the word, kind of weird jaded Leon that's sarcastic with things. And he kind of uses humor in a way to kind of break the tension for things, which is fine. But it's weird. It's weird to see, especially for older fans. But I understand why they did it, because they wanted to grab that new audience. And it worked. I'm not saying it didn't work. Resident Evil 4 became one of Capcom's top-selling games. Like, selling to this day, as of right now, selling well over 10 million copies of Resident Evil 4. And that includes every port, as of this video, it includes every port of Resident Evil 4 except for the VR games and the Switch games. Or the VR game that just kind of recently released and the Switch version of it. Every other copy of Resident Evil 4 is included within those sales. It's over 10 million copies sold of Resident Evil 4. That's a lot. That is a lot. This game has made Capcom a lot of money. It revitalized the Resident Evil franchise. It brought it back from the brink of death. Like, the series was almost dead. Specifically because sales were not where it should have been, or where Capcom wanted it to be. And I think a lot of that had to do with people being kind of tired of that style of gameplay. You think about it. The tank controls, third-person perspective, fixed camera angles style had been done so much. You had it in Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, 0, Code Veronica, and Remake. You also had it in Silent Hill 2 and 3. You had it in, Silent Hill 3 I don't think was out yet at that time. But you also had it in Fatal Frame, which I guess Fatal Frame was later too. But you get the point. You get the point. This style of gameplay was kind of just done. People were just kind of done with it. And they were tired of it. And so changing things up the way that they did just brought new life into the game, or into the franchise. Not to mention, we now had better voice acting. We now had better cinematography into the game. You know, the characters felt more real. They felt more alive. And that reflected in your gameplay. Like, as you play through the game, it reflected in that. And it was fantastic. It was a good feeling to play as Leon and to experience everything that you did with it. You know, like this game, it made me feel like I was playing Resident Evil for the first time. And I think that was entirely the point, and it worked. But now, these days, I don't have the same feelings I did. I don't. As much as I do like Resident Evil 4, I want to say this before we continue on because I'm going to get very critical of this game. As much as I do like Resident Evil 4, there's a lot of things that are wrong with this game. There's a lot of things that, as a repeat player of Resident Evil 4, it just does not hold the same replay value that it used to have. So with that being said, let's get into really digging down into this game. Gameplay wise, now while I did mention that this game kind of brought new life into the series and it changed everything, not only for Resident Evil games, but for other third-person games, at that same time, the game itself is still like the old Resident Evil games. It's still tank controls. A lot of people don't realize that the controls in Resident Evil 4 are still tank controls. Now, what are tank controls? Tank controls are basically you move around, and when you go to aim and shoot, you can't move. Wherever you're aiming, you can't move from that spot. You can move where you're aiming at, but you can't physically move Leon. And that's what tank controls are. You know, besides the fact that the D-pad controls everything, which in RE4 you can move with the D-pad or you can move with the analog. You can move with the D-pad or you can move with the analog stick. But I want to be honest with you, I always play with the D-pad when I'm playing RE4. It feels more natural. It's weird. I don't know how else to explain it. The controls were not perfected. This was the first game that had these kind of controls, and it just wasn't there yet. Not even RE5 did they perfect the controls for this. And it's weird because Dead Space came out before RE5. But we're not going to talk about that right now. We're not getting into that because we're talking about RE4. I got to keep saying this to remind myself because I will go on a tangent about other games. Anyways, the game still had tank controls, whether or not people realized it. And that kind of hurt the game a little bit when it comes to playing the game these days for me, right? And the reason why I say that is because these days, games have perfected those controls. You have games like Last of Us. You have games like Dead Space. You have Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake. Basically, any over-the-shoulder game, they've perfected those controls. You can move the camera around as you move around and aim and shoot all at the same time. In RE4, you cannot do that. You're aiming, you're stuck in that spot, and you can't really move the camera around, but you can move your gun around, which will move the camera around. So these days, when I'm jumping into Resident Evil 4, I have to kind of relearn the controls because I'm so used to modern controls that going backwards and trying to play this, like instinctually, I play it as a modern game and it just does not work. So that's something that, like, these days, it just does not hold up with the controls. Now, you guys might say, oh, you're crazy. No, the controls are fine. But really look at it. Really look at it. Look at the controls from Resident Evil 2 Remake or Last of Us Part 2 or Dead Space and then go back and play RE4. It's completely different. It's a completely different experience because the controls were brand new type of controls. It just was not a perfected mechanic yet. The other thing too, when it comes to combat, is the combat loop is drastically the same throughout the entirety of combat. Again, it was new. It's something different. So in prior Resident Evil games, you had the option to carry a knife with you, but the knife always took up an inventory slot. Outside of Code Veronica, the knives in every Resident Evil game were crap. They just weren't worth the inventory slot. They did no damage. They did not stun the enemies. You couldn't move and slash at the same time. The knives didn't work. And I say outside of Code Veronica because Code Veronica has arguably the best knife in any Resident Evil game. But in RE4, the knife no longer took an inventory slot. The knife was mapped to one of your buttons. It was your left shoulder button. So being mapped to that, so you just go ahead and push that, and instead of your right shoulder button to aim, this one brings out your knife, and then you can go ahead and slash, which is an awesome addition to the gameplay because you no longer had to worry about carrying a knife with you. Now, the reason why I mention this is because the gameplay loop or the combat loop, it goes the same way. You shoot the enemies in the legs, and they will fall to their knees, and if they fall to their knees, you can run up to them and kick them or suplex them using a quick time button, which we're going to talk about the quick time events because I got problems with those. Now, if the enemy they fall completely to the floor, or after you kick them and after you suplex them and they don't die, you can go ahead, run up to them, take out your knife, and just slash at them. Essentially, you just need to shoot the enemy once if you shoot them in the right spot, and they'll fall down, basically just saving all your ammo. And you go ahead and just slice at them on the floor until they die. Now, some enemies will change it up later on. Their heads will explode, showing the Plagas parasite, and then you have to waste more ammo on that, or you can throw a flash grenade, which then kills them instantly. Other enemies, including the regenerators, you can still shoot their legs off and slash them while they're on the floor. Like, that is still a viable option, and it still works very, very well. So that's why I said, like, the combat loop for the normal enemies are basically all the same, considering how many of these enemies show up. Like, it's very easy to just shoot them all, like, till they fall in a group together and slash them all over and over again in one swing. It's fun the first couple times, but then even towards the end of the game, you're still doing the same kind of gameplay loop, or the still kind of same combat loop, that in an action game with very little variety that way, it just kind of gets a little boring. Now, there are options where you can go ahead and kind of experiment with the different guns and stuff, but eventually, I mean, it all just kind of blends in, and you just kind of go on autopilot mode, or at least I do when I play this game. Like, I just rinse and repeat the same style of combat every single time, just because it's so easy to do, even on professional mode. Now, the inventory system, I like the inventory system a lot, especially compared to the other Resident Evil games. So the older Resident Evil games, you're limited to a certain amount of items, in a sense that, like, you have, depending on the Resident Evil game, 6 to 10 item slots, and you're limited to those item slots. A little key that, like, if you and I were grabbing a key, right, we could put it in our pocket, and it wouldn't take up, like, the same amount of space as a shotgun would. But in the old Resident Evil games, that's how it was. Resident Evil 4 kind of remedies this into a grid item management system, and it works extremely well, because if you have an egg, obviously it's not going to take the same amount of space as a rifle, right? The rifle is going to take up a lot more inventory space. So this is on a grid spot, and the egg will take up 1 square, while the rifle will take up like 10. It's probably more than that. I'm not counting them right now, but you get the idea, right? So everything is based off of this grid, and you can expand your inventory grid throughout the game by purchasing larger cases from the merchant, up to a extra large case. And that is a fantastic way for them to do the item management system. I really, really like that. That is a very good system that they added into the game. So kudos to them for doing so. It's also the same system that they brought back in Resident Evil Village. It's weird because they had this system in RE4, but then got rid of it in RE5 and went back to kind of the old style with the item slots in Resident Evil 5. And then Resident Evil 6, they did a completely different inventory system from that. RE7 kind of went back to the grid, but a much, much smaller grid. And then you had RE Village, which had the same grid as RE4. So it's interesting the way that they did that. But again, RE4, I really like the inventory system. But the reason why this game, I call this game, it's an action horror, which is what it is. I mean, back in the day when it released, they said it was a survival horror game, and you can even look, if you have the cases for Resident Evil 4, look at the back of the case for the GameCube and the PS2 version, and it will say destined to be the greatest survival horror game of all time. But they changed it because it's not a survival horror game. Resident Evil 4 basically pioneered the action horror subgenre of horror. A survival horror is a subgenre of horror as well. So action horror was defined by Resident Evil 4. And these days, if you look at the case for Resident Evil 4, like on the PS4 or the Xbox, on the back, it no longer says survival horror. On the back, it now says pulse-pounding action. And this is from Game Informer, who says pulse-pounding action. And Game Informer was the one who said destined to be the greatest survival horror game of all time. So they no longer, on the case, call this game survival horror because it's not. This game pioneered action horror. And that's something that carried through from RE4 to RE5 to RE6, and then once again in Resident Evil Village. So because of that, because it's action horror, it puts a heavy emphasis on action. It no longer has the survival mechanics. And the survival mechanics that I'm talking about is limited resources. So you have the limited inventory, but you don't have the limited resources in RE4. In the prior RE games, if you play Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, Code Veronica, Resident Evil 0, or Remake, any one of those games, they all have a finite amount of resources within the game. If you collected all the ammo in any one of those games and you fired all of that ammo, you got rid of all that ammo, you would have no ammo left. You would not be able to collect any more ammo if you collected all of it and shot all of it. And that's because enemies don't drop items. In RE4, enemies drop items. And because enemies drop items, specifically ammo and healing items, that makes Resident Evil 4 no longer survival horror because it got rid of the one of the most important survival mechanics is that limited resources. So Resident Evil 4 getting rid of the survival mechanics, it fits the game because it's an action game. Not to mention the enemies drop money, which then you can buy weapons and upgrades and all that stuff from the merchant, which again feeds into that action part of everything. Resident Evil 4 also did something that games didn't do back then, and that was adaptive difficulty. This was something that wasn't really noticed until, I would say, like relatively recently in RE4, because when you play through it, you don't really notice it. The game adapts to your playstyle. The better you do, the harder the game is. The worse you're doing, the easier the game is. This is seen a lot in certain rooms where you might encounter a whole bunch of enemies, and if you are not doing so well, you'll start to encounter less enemies in that section. This is more specifically in the standard gameplay, not really professional mode. In professional mode, it just stays at the hardest difficulty the entire time. But through the adaptive difficulty, enemies will hit you harder if you're doing better, or they will do less damage if you're doing worse. Like I mentioned, there will be less enemies if you're doing worse. There will be more enemies if you're doing better. So things like that it's very interesting the way that they added that kind of gameplay mechanic that, again, we never saw that before in any Resident Evil game. I can't even honestly think of any other game at that time that had that kind of gameplay mechanic. That was something that was completely new. And I'm all for it. Don't get me wrong. I am all for that because that is fantastic. These days, you see more games doing stuff like that. RE2 Remake specifically does that. So if you're doing better, the enemies or the zombies will do more damage. Not so much be harder to kill, but they will do more damage themselves. So it's things like that that you see more so in games now. You even see it in Resident Evil Village, and I want to say that it's also in RE5 and RE6, but I haven't really paid attention to RE5 and RE6 as much as RE4 when it comes to adaptive difficulty, but I'm sure that it's there. And you see it in other games too, like Dead Space has it as well. Although it's not as prevalent, but it is there. So again, it's more gameplay mechanics that Resident Evil 4 has done that has influenced gaming as a whole, which again is a good thing. I'm all for that. That is fantastic, and I'm glad that they implemented that kind of gameplay mechanic into the game. So definitely not a criticism on that. That's something that I'm going to praise it for and always praise it for, because it should be praised. And speaking of things to not praise, we're going to talk about that QTE stuff, the QuickTime event stuff, because that is nonsense. In RE4, it's not so bad. But the thing is that we've been so accustomed to watching a cutscene in a game at the time of Resident Evil 4 release anyways. If a cutscene showed up, you could put your controller down for just kind of a second and kind of breathe through it. But the developers, when it came to developing Resident Evil 4, they said, no, fuck that. And added a whole new level of immersion to where if it's a cutscene, you kind of have to be on your toes because there could be a QuickTime event in there. QuickTime event meaning you got to push some buttons so that way you don't die. And that happens quite a bit. Specifically the case with Krauser. When Leon's fighting Krauser hand to hand, the first encounter with Krauser, you have a whole QuickTime event there. That's probably the most notable one. But there's other ones before that, and obviously ones after it. But in RE4, the QuickTime events, like, it pioneered QuickTime events when it came to the Resident Evil games. And honestly, I think a lot of games in general took notes from Resident Evil 4 when it came to QuickTime events. I hate QuickTime events. They are so bad. I really do. They're annoying. They're very, very annoying. I understand why they did it. Again, it's a new gameplay mechanic at the time, and it just added for that immersion, but it just got to the point it just got annoying, especially in later entries, Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6, where they just did them more and more often and just became more invasive at that point. It wasn't immersion, it was more invasive. In fact, it became immersion breaking because they just kept on throwing them in your face. Where RE4 didn't do it as much, but it still had the QuickTime events when you were fighting the regular enemies, with the aforementioned kicks and suplexes that Leon could do. And then in the cutscenes, as I mentioned as well. But it didn't feel as invasive in RE4 as later entries did. But the fact that they added, or, it kind of pioneered the QuickTime event thing, it kind of added to the downfall of Resident Evil, which we're going to get to towards the end of this video. And I know that we've been kind of rambling on about Resident Evil 4, but this is a discussion. This is a very hot topic to discuss when it's, for the Resident Evil games, just in general. Other games are easier to discuss, but Resident Evil 4 is just one of those that I can't gloss over some things in Resident Evil 4. We have to discuss this. But yeah, QuickTime events, they were trash. I really, oh god. In the remake, again, as of this video, remake's not out yet. So maybe this won't age well, I don't know. In the remake, god, I hope there's no QuickTime events. Please don't put QuickTime events in the remake. I'm begging you. We're gonna know soon. We're gonna know soon. Anyways, RE4 has pacing issues. Like, the first portion of the game is fantastic. The village portion, it kept things on your toes. It was creepy. It was good. It was the atmosphere and the environment itself was fantastic. The way that they pulled everything together, the village section was very, very creepy. But as you progress through the game and you get to the castle section, everything starts to slow down a lot. And the pacing just goes to a crawl. Like, you're running through the castle section and it just seems to never end. And then after the castle section, once you get past that, even the next section after that just seems to not end, which I think is the island section. It's one of those weird moments in the game where they need to cut out some parts, or they needed to cut out some parts, and it just feels like a lot of fluff. It's kind of like Final Fantasy VII Remake. Those of you guys who played Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's a fantastic game, but there's a lot of filler and a lot of fluff in that. Maybe we'll do a retrospective on that too, but I'm just using that as an example. Like, there's a lot of filler in Resident Evil 4 that I feel like doesn't need to be there, or they could cut out just to keep the pacing going. And instead of it being like a 4 to 5 hour game on an average playthrough, it's more so like a 8 to 12 hour game on an average playthrough, being one of the longer ones. Not the longest, but still being one of the longer Resident Evil games that's available to play. It's still, I can still play RE4 in one sitting, right? But that's a 6 hour sitting if I'm rushing through this game, or 6, 7, 8 hour sitting, as opposed to like popping in a classic Resident Evil game and beating it in under 3 hours. So it's one of those games where it's like it's just the right amount of length to be able to play it quick enough in like 2 days, but it's still at that same point where it feels longer than it actually is, if that makes sense. Like, you ever, like, you're sitting in class, right? Like, those of you guys who are watching, you're sitting in class, and you got like 10 minutes left in class, but all of a sudden you're staring at the clock and it seems like it's not moving, and then it starts going backwards, where it's like, oh my god, this is the longest 10 minutes I've ever experienced in my life. That's kind of how RE4 is. It's not that it's very long, but it feels long because of how slow the gameplay actually becomes. Like, the first portions of the village section and all that, it's great because it's so quick. And when I say quick, I mean like it's so fast paced that you don't even realize that 3 hours have passed by. But by the time you get past that and you get to the castle section, it gets slow. The environment gets kind of boring. It's not as creepy anymore. It's almost like it feels like a different game. And again, with the island section, by the time you get to the island section, now the action's just off the walls. Like, you have a helicopter at that point that's coming in and shooting everybody up. Like, it's just action at that point. There's no more horror. The horror was just in the beginning with the village section, and everything else after that is just on rails action, except for the castle, which is just slow. So that's why this game, like, when I say things like, it has some problems, this is one of those problems. The pacing issues in RE4 is so glaring now, these days, that when I first played it, I didn't notice it. But now, as like I replay this game, and it's harder and harder to replay it. And I don't want you guys to think that like I'm harping on it because I think it's a bad game or that I don't like the game. I love the game. I think it's a great game. I think it's a fun game to play. And I've constantly said that this game, because before the remake was announced, people would ask me, oh, should RE4 be remade? And I would always say, no, it doesn't need to be remade. Code Veronica needs a remake. But Resident Evil 4 doesn't need a remake. The HD remaster on PS4 and Xbox, they play at 60 FPS. The gameplay is fine. Everything looks good. Like, it still kind of holds up. But, that's even with the problems that I'm saying. Like, it still kind of holds up. So I don't want you guys to think that like I'm harping on the game because I don't like it. I do like the game. If I didn't, I wouldn't have played it as much, and I wouldn't be as critical of the game as I am if I didn't like the game. So and again, it's one of these things that like you have a very divisive fan base these days when it comes to RE4. So with that being said, let's talk about the additions to RE4 on PS2 and later, because the GameCube version, as I mentioned, doesn't have separate ways. It doesn't have assignment Ada. The PS2 and on added those things, and I feel like they added those things to tie it into the prior or the pre-existing lore for Resident Evil, because again, there was no real connection with Umbrella. There was no connection to anything that really happened prior in RE2, RE3, nothing like that. But with the addition of separate ways, now there is, because now you have interaction with Ada and Wesker. So having Wesker in the game, even if it's just like via, phone call or video chat or whatever, early FaceTime, it even with just that, it's still an inclusion that was added later on to kind of bridge that gap, because we didn't really, outside of the little excerpt in the beginning of the main campaign, we didn't know what happened with Umbrella. We didn't know what was going on with Wesker. Like that whole plot line with Wesker after Code Veronica was just kind of left in the open, right? It wasn't resolved until RE5, but we'll get there. Oh boy, we'll get there. Adding the separate ways was a good way to kind of bridge that gap and give us a chance to play as Ada. I mean, I think that was probably on a lot of people's wish list, was to play as Ada, and here we are getting that wish granted. And I think it was a good inclusion. I really do. I enjoyed that. Because who didn't want to play as Ada? Like, look, if you didn't want to play as Ada, fine. You're wrong, because everybody wanted to play as Ada. So I'm glad that they added that in there. Now, is the separate ways section perfect? Oh, absolutely not. But it was still fun. And these days, if oh my god, if the remake releases and separate ways is a DLC to purchase, I am going to raise hell. I'm saying that right now. Because the separate ways and the assignment Ada, I feel like is something that these days they would do as DLC instead of actually including it within the game. And if they do that, oh, I'm going to be upset. I'm going to be upset. So very upset. I don't think they will, just because, like in RE2 Remake, there's the fourth survivor, there's Tofu. Like, they have everything that the original had. So, and not to mention, they even had more with the Ghost Survivors DLC, which was free. So, I'm hoping they kind of treat Assignment Ada and Separate Ways the same way with the remake, but we'll see what happens when that releases. Maybe this won't age well. I don't know. When it comes to the story for RE4, the story is kind of okay. I mean, it's Leon going to save the president's daughter, Ashley, as she was kidnapped and being held for ransom or something like that. So, yeah, there's that. And Leon travels to Spain to go rescue her. That's the story. Pretty simple. Oh, and these villagers are being taken over by Las Plagas, which is kind of like a parasite thing, which recently was retconned because of, what was it, Resident Evil Resistance? And so now the Las Plagas are tied to the Nemesis parasite because of Resident Evil 3 and Remake and Resident Evil Resistance. We'll see where that goes with the remake of Resident Evil 4. We'll see what happens on that. I don't know if they're gonna tie it into the Nemesis parasite or not. If they do, that'd be interesting. But we're talking about the original release. So as of original release, they're just like insect things. So yeah. Oh, and they infect Leon and Ashley with these parasites as well, which causes for some interesting tidbits. Like it a lot of the time, Ashley just seems like a spoiled brat. Like, she's 20, but she seems like such a spoiled brat. I hate Ashley so much. Like, you save her, and then she's like, "Get away from me!" And then she runs away, and I'm just like, why? Why did you run away like that? Like, you know that I'm here to save you, and you're like, "Get away from me!" And you like, no, that doesn't make sense. I don't like Ashley. Ashley's up there with like one of the most annoying characters in video game history. Not even just like Resident Evil. No, she's up there with like Navi from Ocarina of Time. She's for me, she's either number 1 or number 2. She goes back and forth depending on my mood for the day, whether or not she's the most annoying or Navi from Ocarina of Time is the most annoying. One of those two takes that number 1 spot. And like I mentioned, it just depends on my mood. So, you know, over time, Ashley can really, really get to you. Oh, man. There's some days where I just like to take the knife and just, you know, just kind of do the thing for the enemies, you know? Just, oh, Ashley, you know, like gone. What happened to Ashley, Leon? Oh, I don't know. Like by the time I got there, unfortunately, it was already too late. A stray bullet came from nowhere out of the side. Sorry. You get the idea. So, how does this game hold up? Well, all the things that I mentioned. Let's talk about one of the biggest factors when it comes to how I look at games. Replayability. This game has a massive amount of replayability. Because of the costumes you can get, because of the different modes. You have standard mode, you have professional mode, you have assignment ADA, you have separate ways, you have mercenaries. This game has a ton of unlockables, has a ton of replayability, and I love that. Absolutely love that. For me, when it comes to Resident Evil games, because they're usually on the shorter side, you want them to have massive replayability. And I say usually on the shorter side because RE5 and RE6 are not on the shorter side, and so because of that, their replayability goes down. We'll talk about that when we get there. But RE4 has a lot of replayability, and I am very glad that it does, because it keeps me invested in the game. And any game that has a lot of replayability to it, and especially a game that's as accessible as RE4 is, that's a win. That is always a win, and it makes it easier to purchase a game like this because of that replayability, because it gives me reasons to go back to the game, especially if I enjoy the game. If I didn't enjoy the game, I wouldn't replay it. Like, I would just play it once, be done with it, toss it aside, you're done. Maybe I'll touch on the game later on just to record a video or something, but you're done. Right? Like, that's how I feel with RE6. I don't like playing RE6. I'll play it because I need to record something or whatever, or to make an example of it. I don't like RE6, so I don't replay it. RE4, I'll replay it. I don't mind replaying it. It's kind of a chill time when I am playing it. If I'm live streaming it, it's kind of a chill time when I'm live streaming it. I know a lot of people really love this game, and that's why I love talking about it, because not only can I talk to people about this game and tell them how I feel, they can tell me how they feel for the game, and we can understand each other and understand our own reasonings for feeling how we feel when it comes to Resident Evil 4. This game is one of these games that I can recommend to people to play. And it's kind of like a safe recommendation. Whereas RE2 and RE3, like the original versions on PS1, I would love to recommend people play those games, but the problem is that they're so old that the game mechanics just might not appeal to them. And I know people who would love to play the games, and they've even told me they would love to play the original games, but they just don't like the tank controls, and it just makes it difficult for them to play the game. Where RE4 is a little bit easier for them to jump into because it's closer to modern gameplay while still kind of being that old style tank control gameplay, which I mentioned before. So that's why RE4 is kind of a safe recommendation when it comes to Resident Evil games. So when people are always asking me, oh, what's a good Resident Evil game to jump into? I'll typically say RE4 or RE2 Remake, or even RE7. Like, those are the games that I will typically recommend to a newcomer to the series. Where other people might be like, oh, play Resident Evil Remake, start from the older games. I'm kind of a realist when it comes to it. While I would love to recommend the original games or RE Remake, the fact of the matter is people are so used to a new style of gameplay or modern controls that it's not so easy for them to jump into those games, whereas RE4, RE2 Remake, RE7 is a much easier game for them to jump into as a newcomer to the series. But let's now touch on the elephant in the room. That RE4, while it was the game that saved the franchise because Resident Evil was losing sales, as I mentioned, it's also the start of the downfall of Resident Evil. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, you just said it sold over 10 million units. Yes, it did, and it did very well, was very well received within the community and within the critics. But because of the change to action, because of the quick time mechanics, everything that this game brought, Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 took that to an extreme, to where even though Resident Evil 5 has sold 13 million copies and Resident Evil 6 has sold over 11 million copies, they were not as well received as Resident Evil 4. And Resident Evil 6 wasn't critically well received. It wasn't well received within the community, and it's quite often lauded as one of the worst Resident Evil games. Even with as successfully commercially sales, right? Like commercial sales goes, it was successful. But even Capcom saw it as a kind of failure. And that all stems from RE4. Because all those mechanics and everything that RE4 brought to the table that was good also caused the bad. So that's why this game is kind of now being looked at as kind of like a divisive game, as I mentioned. And that brings us full circle to what I was talking about in the beginning as to why this is kind of a difficult game to talk about. Because it gives us that turning point where it revitalized the franchise, but also caused the downfall of it until Resident Evil 7 came around, which then revitalized it once again. Which maybe after the next Resident Evil mainline game, Resident Evil 7 might be the cause of the downfall again. But I'm hoping we don't get to that point. I'm hoping we don't. I'm hoping Resident Evil 9 is fantastic and, whatever. But, it's just that division that happens. And again, this is either your favorite Resident Evil or it's just kind of a mediocre Resident Evil to you. There aren't really people who hate Resident Evil 4. There's either people who love it, or they're just kind of, it's okay, it's a good game. They're kind of nonchalant about it. I'm kind of one of those that I'm like, kind of nonchalant about it. Like, it's a good game. It is. Has some problems, and I will always say that. If somebody asks me, is Resident Evil 4 a good Resident Evil game? I'll say it's a good game. It's a good Resident Evil game. It has problems, though. But at that same time, no Resident Evil game is a perfect Resident Evil game. Like, all of them have problems. Even Resident Evil Remake, which I consider to be the best Resident Evil game, all these games have problems. I can nitpick anything out of any Resident Evil game. Even my favorite one, Resident Evil 3 or Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil Village, I can nitpick all of them with some issues. Because there's no such thing as a perfect game. There's always room for improvement. And Resident Evil 4, like I mentioned, gameplay mechanics in Resident Evil 4 weren't perfected yet. This was the first time that this kind of game released. So those are my thoughts on Resident Evil 4. I know this was kind of a long video, and I'm kind of all over the place in a way, but I kind of had to be. There's no way that I could script out this video and talk about Resident Evil 4 and give my full thoughts and opinions on this in a script, because it wouldn't convey how I feel about the game properly. So I hope that I was able to do that in talking about this game. And I can almost guarantee you this is not going to be the last time we talk about this game. There's so much within this game to talk about. If I just kept going, this would be like a 3-hour video. But I wanted to get my main points across. Resident Evil 4 is a fantastic game. It is. I enjoy it. I still enjoy it. But it's not the game that I'm going to go ahead and pick up and play. I would rather, personally, these days, pick up RE2 Remake, RE7, RE3, not remake, the original RE3. Resident Evil Remake, like the remake of the first game. I would rather pick up those games before I pick up RE4 to just play. But if somebody asked me to play RE4, I don't mind it. I'm okay playing it. So with that being said, thank you all for watching. I appreciate it. And if you enjoyed it, you want to support the content, hit the thumbs up, subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys in the next Resident Evil video. Or any other video, honestly, depending on how you're jumping around on my channel. So, enjoy.